In the last 2 centuries, fossil fuel has kept our societies running, making it possible for us to live in environments hitherto uninhabitable, allowed us to expand our cities vertically, and increase the velocity of life. In doing so, it has radically intensified inequality between societies and made the wars we fight more dehumanizing and brutal. The Cosmopolitan Shipwrecks ask, how do the properties of energy forms, understood within their transient production contexts, extractive capitalism, and currents in democratic evolution, combine to shape our imagining of the collective? Our guest is Timothy Mitchell. He is Professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Africa Studies and of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He is the author of Carbon Democracy that elaborates on the political power in the age of oil.
Greetings and welcome to a new episode of the Cosmopolitan Shipwrecks. So I would like to welcome Professor Timothy Mitchell and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mohammad. It's great to be shipwrecked with you.
Great, thank you. And also would like to welcome Arturo Desimone and thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you.
I would like to first start with the first sentence in the book, which is, fossil fuels help create modern democracy, but also its limits. So I find it interesting because when I first read it and then read the whole book and then came back to it, it's like, it's the introduction, but also a summary of what one expects in the book. So I would like first to start from giving a historical context, how carbon democracy, like the word carbon and democracy, the two forces kind of come together. So in the first chapter, you discuss how coal miners were able to influence labor movements positively because of their working environments and because of the autonomous environment they had, like when extracting coal or transporting them. So, like, can you elaborate more on what were the tools they used to kind of influence the movements?
Sure. So the book began with this puzzle that very strong sense that the rise of modern mass democracy happened thanks to fossil fuels, and in particular to coal, because coal gave rise to industrial civilization, to urbanization, large cities, and the possibilities of the kinds of mass politics in the late 19th and the 20th century that we associate with the rise of modern democracy. But I was asking that question at the time when oil seemed to represent the fossil fuels we depend on today, including oil and coal, seemed to represent the very opposite of that possibility, to represent threats to democracy, particularly as it existed in the form of the Middle East and wars in the Middle East, but also, of course, the threat represented by climate catastrophe. So I went back to look, as you say, at the history of coal in the 19th century. And I actually realized something important about that moment, not really the beginnings of coal production in the early 19th century, but more so later in the 19th century, early 20th century, when we became much more dependent on coal. It was associated with electricity, the generation of electricity, with railways and other forms of transportation. And what you had was a moment when the sources of energy in a particular country, in an industrialized country, were so concentrated on this one fossil fuel that workers in that industry, for the first time in history, could shut down the productive life of an entire country. And that was, of course, the phenomenon that came to be known as the general strike. And what was interesting to me about the general strike was its association, not just with the rise of labor movements in particular, but with this dependence on a single source of energy. That the coal from the coal face in the coal mines to the docks, to the trains that it was moved on, to the power stations where it was burnt to produce electricity, every one of those was a kind of choke point. And you actually only needed to organize a strike at those few key points, and you could paralyze or threaten to paralyze an industrial system of production. That was entirely new in human history. And I think that gave rise to the possibility of mass democracy, because it was either the use of the general strike or just the the ability to threaten the use of that general strike, that cutting off of the key nodes of an energy supply system, that forced ruling classes in the West to start listening seriously for the first time to the demands of working people for improvements in collective life. So that was a critical moment in the rise of mass democracy. Whereas other people had talked about democracy in terms of more liberal attitudes to the world or abilities to associate together and meet, it was energy and the structure of an energy system that created a vulnerability that working people could use in their favor and bring about a movement to secure basic improvements in life.
So, Professor Mitchell, this is quite fascinating, this connection between the general strike, coal and democracy, and its emergence. And after the Second World War, there was, of course, almost of revolutionary proportions, a shift from coal to oil. In the book, you discuss multiple reasons for this shift or this change, including transportation, a number of other issues. What was the role of the large corporations in this change, and what were their motivations in terms of power and in terms of other motivations, and what were the roles of new imperial power players? How did they collude with capital, leading, for example, to the creation of Aramco, an American-owned company for Saudi oil?
So the transition from dependence on a single fossil fuel to dependence on coal, but increasingly on oil, took place over a period of time in the interwar period. But it was really consolidated, and the use of oil expanded rapidly after the Second World War, as you say. The interesting thing is that move to oil and the rise of oil as the supplementary and then as the dominant fossil fuel seems to coincide with a whole series of setbacks to the development of democratic politics, above all in the places that became the new sites of energy production in the Middle East and elsewhere. Now, part of that can be understood in a very simple way in terms of the difference between coal and oil. First of all, you've got a second fuel, so it's going to be harder to shut down an energy system than it was when dependent on just one major source of fossil energy. But the second thing is that you've now opened up a gap between where the energy is used and where the energy is produced, because most of the energy was being used in the post-war period in the countries that had first industrialized using coal. So that was in Europe and in North America. But while North America produced oil, Europe produced very little. And most of the oil started to come from the Middle East. So if you like, in that period, Europe and the West in general began to outsource its energy production. We know of outsourcing more recently, the method of moving the manufacturing of products to regions with lower labor costs and less robust protection for workers. But in a sense, long before manufacturing moved overseas, energy production moved overseas. And that, of course, began to weaken the labor movements that had built their strength on the ability to disrupt the supply of energy. But there was also something about oil itself, which was that unlike coal, oil is liquid, it's moved in pipelines and tankers, and it's moved around the globe. And that meant just on a practical level, it was much harder for workers to interrupt the supply of oil. It's not that they didn't try, just as the rise of coal had seen the rise of political movements, of strikes, of labor unions, and so on. In Western Europe, the rise of an oil industry in the Middle East in the 20th century saw similar attempts to organize labor unions and worker movements and to strike and demand political rights. But oil didn't lend itself in the same way as coal to this disruption of energy supplies, this ability to sabotage the supply of energy in the interests of demanding greater social political rights. Of course, as you mentioned in your question, that was associated with a new form of control over the supply of energy, the multinational corporation. And that was significant because, if you like, just as workers lost the power to interrupt the supply of energy, to build their own power by sabotaging at critical moments, it didn't mean that the power of sabotage went away. The ability to interrupt, to restrict, to set back the production of energy passed into new hands because, for reasons the book explores, the control of oil became concentrated in the hands of just a very small number, a handful of companies. And those were these new international oil companies. They had their beginnings in the early 20th century, and by the mid 20th century, just half a dozen of them, 7 of them, controlled most of the world's oil supply. And the power of those companies was very much built on that monopoly position, and using that monopoly position, not simply to produce oil. Oil is easy to produce. It comes out of the ground historically very cheaply. What they could use that monopoly power was to sabotage, in other words, to restrict and to limit the supply of oil in order to turn it into the source not of democratic rights anymore, but of extraordinary forms of corporate profit.
The concept of sabotage plays a very interesting, a double-edged role in your work. So sabotage was used apparently by workers, and you also mentioned, for example, the geography of inside the mines, which allowed a certain freedom despite the hard work for the miners to plot. That was very interesting. And but the sabotage can be used by these workers, but it could also be used by corporations as a tool, for example, to hide information for competitors, a form of, it sounds like a form of industrial espionage. So could you tell us more about this concept of sabotage and how it was used also by corporations to increase demand, for example?
Yeah, sabotage is an interesting word. It came into political use early in the 20th century, particularly, specifically in that age of general strikes. And then it was taken up First World War, and it became associated with sort of military actions and blowing things up. But that wasn't its initial meaning. Sabotage was the subtle disruption of a technical system through some kind of strike action or work to rule that used the intricacies of the technical system to interrupt it or to threaten it in such a way that you could build a political demand, not just by making your voice heard somewhere where no one would listen to it, but by making it work through the industrial process, through the energy process. And as I say, the distinctive thing about coal was that when it was the only fuel, it provided those points of vulnerability where sabotage in forms of strikes, of works to rule, of other kinds of disruptions could be effectively used by a workforce. When I say that it shifted, both workers were weakened, lost, if you like, the power of sabotage because of the addition of a second major source of energy. And also, you mentioned the sort of relative freedom of workers underground with coal. That was another difference with oil. One doesn't want to exaggerate the benefits of that life. Of course, coal mining had extraordinary hardships, but it was very hard for management to supervise energy production when it took place underground. Coal, with oil, it's all taking place on the surface. Management has much more direct control over the workforce, and then the fact that the workforce is more easily displaced by the ability to pump oil, to ship oil in fluid forms, and so on. So the sabotage moves, as it were, into the hands of corporations because they are now the ones who can interrupt its flow because they control much more than workers, the ability to increase or slow down the rate of flow. The sort of shift in understanding here is the standard story of corporations, and particularly multinational corporations, is that they grew up in the 20th century into these very large, very powerful organizations because things got larger, things got more powerful. The oil industry was a big thing and needed big business firms to control it. None of that is true. You can produce oil with business organized on all kinds of different scales, from small to large. What the large business firm, the multinational firm, represented was the extraordinary power you could get from the monopolization of the power to sabotage or interrupt the flow of oil. And they existed not because we needed more and more oil, but because if one could construct a need for oil, then one could make more and more money out of the power to monopolize it, including that ability to sabotage, restrict its flow, and therefore, of course, increase the price.
Curiously, the etymology of sabotage is fairly modern, and it's at some point related to a word from French for shoe, and in Spanish the verb is zapatear, or having to do with Zapata, like the surname of the revolutionary. Just a piece of trivia.
I think the Spanish actually came from the Arabic, so we can fight over that.
I have a follow-up question, or two follow-up questions. The first one is, you mentioned there was a monopoly of power as well. And how was the labor movement in the Middle East? How did they look like? They were crushed also, as you mentioned in the book, but then they would try to organize themselves. And then you hear always these narratives that the Middle East is kind of always like that. There's always a lack of democracy, lack of freedom, all this. So can you elaborate more how the organization of labor was crushed in that region?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long history, and obviously in the region as a whole, it doesn't only involve oil and many other industries across the region built up large workforces, and we know in some detail the history of some of those. But to me, in thinking about fossil fuels, the interesting thing to know was, given that the incredible opportunities to organize a workforce and to demand democratic rights made by coal, why didn't that happen with oil? And I've tried to summarize some of the reasons for that come down in some ways to the very different way oil is produced and shipped and so on. You just cannot, at the level of workers, so easily interrupt its flow. So unions were organized, strikes were held. There were a series of very powerful strikes in the Iranian oil industry, particularly after the Second World War, though some of them go back earlier to the 1930s. The Iraqi oil industry, the Saudi oil industry, you have unions in Saudi Arabia, you have demands for workers' rights, but also for political constitutions and so on. What happens is that those strikes and those attempts to unionize happen at a moment of anti-colonial struggle. Even in countries that were not directly colonized, like Iran, they were still subject to extensive control of imperial powers. And what that means is that an emergent nationalist movement in Iran, in Iraq, even in Saudi Arabia, can translate that workers' demand for the political rights of workers and for more egalitarian forms of life into an anti-imperial demand that the foreigners get their hands off the oil, so that the wave of strikes in Iran in the late 1940s gets transformed by a liberal middle-class political movement into a demand to nationalize the oil and for the Iranian state to take control of the oil. And that then is followed in all the other countries. So the first thing that happens is, because of the colonial context, there's this translation into a national and state demand rather than the demand of the workers. And the other thing is that it's happening in a context in which the region, as I say, has been colonized, but more than that, after the formal end of colonialism, the West organizes its dependence on oil in ways I'll maybe talk about a little bit more, and produces the idea in people's minds that this oil is of a vital strategic interest to the West. And therefore, the Middle East becomes this region where you can continually go to war. You can intervene. You can either do it on a small scale with coups, with interventions, or you can do it on a larger scale, as we've seen over the last 2 or 3 decades. And the Middle East became this site of wars on a scale that really, and certainly a frequency and a repetitiveness, which no other region saw. Now, that's not the only reasons for the defeats, but I think the construction of the idea that somehow the security of the world was at stake in somehow controlling the oil was vital to understanding, or as an additional reason for the defeat of those labor movements and for the inability to found on oil a more democratic form of politics.
And we will for sure get to the military and the wars at one stage further in the interview. I just want to pick up on what you mentioned, like how demand was constructed, how lifestyles were constructed in Western countries and in the US. And you mentioned one example, how the SUVs was marketed as a sign of being modern or just the new lifestyle, but it was kind of just drinking oil somehow the whole time and trying to survive. And
yeah. Right, if you want to make a lot of money out of oil, which was the central thing going on here, particularly with the rise of these multinational corporations, you can do 2 things. You can sabotage the supply, and that happened continuously. Restrict the supply, even with the British in Iraq, drill a well, find oil, and quickly cap it, so as not to give away its existence. Because the oil you were producing, the same company was producing next door in Iran, was more valuable, and so on. So you can sabotage the supply through forms of monopoly and restriction, but you can also produce the same tightness of prices and levels of profit if you work on the other end of it by producing more and more demand. So you can organize forms of living that are extraordinarily dependent on oil. And the obvious and example of that is the United States. The United States went through forms of industrial development and growth in the same way that Northwest Europe did, but it did it in a way that was organized around the consumption of oil, to such an extent that by not just in the post-war period when America was really in a much better economic position, but throughout the second half of the 20th century, even till today, the US consumes twice as much oil per capita, even than other advanced industrialized countries. And that is about building lifestyles that are organized around extraordinarily high levels of dependence on oil, which was a deliberate act promoted by both oil companies and by governments, state governments, and others that were relentless in their support of the interests of fossil fuels. We've just seen this week in Texas with the unprecedented freeze and snowstorms in Texas. The local politics is in the hands of fossil fuel interests that want to blame the breakdown of their gas pipelines on green energy, and just a little contemporary illustration of how powerful those kinds of interests are. So at that level, you can organize extremely high levels of consumption. But there's another way in which that happens, which happens at the same period in this post-war decades, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which is that even beyond a focus on developing lifestyles in terms of suburbia and private ownership of cars there, and forms of housing that are extremely expensive in terms of the use of fossil fuels, you can also develop an entire sort of political ideology around that, which says that we can both afford this and we can do it infinitely. And that political ideology rests on the invention of a new idea, which only comes into circulation in the mid-20th century and can very much be associated with this abundant form of life around fossil fuels. That's the idea of the economy. Before the mid-20th century, no economist talks about the economy. It comes into being as the thing that seems to be the center of life, the purpose of government in the mid-20th century. And it comes into being, it's measured and defined in such a way that it seems to be this thing that can grow infinitely. Nobody thought those ways about expansion and growth before that, but the particular way the economy is counted and measured, it seems to be this thing that can grow forever. And that then lends further to support to these forms of economic life and fossil fuel-based life that are going to depend on high levels of consumption of fossil fuels.
When it comes to, I mean, this is all very interesting, and I cannot help but think of George W. Bush talking about the American way of life shall not be in any way impeded. And by the way, I was born and raised on an island very close to Venezuela, which depended at that point on the oil refinery, Venezuelan oil, and there are many SUVs running around there. So,
and the refinery was on the island because that was the way to defeat the threat of workers. Even though the oil was being produced on the Venezuelan mainland, you put the refinery somewhere where it's protected against the risk of strikes.
Well, that's I had not thought about Aruba in that way before. So in your work, inevitably you touch upon the IMF and the World Bank, which were, of course, founded, or we associate these with Bretton Woods and John Maynard Keynes. Around that time, had also proposed a third institution, an institution that would handle the flow of oil, that was devoted specifically to this. Why was this project envisioned at the very dawn of Bretton Woods? Why was this abandoned completely? Why haven't we heard about it? And what would have been its role had it happened?
So in the post-war period, Keynes and other architects of the post-war financial system are looking back to what happened in the interwar period, including, of course, the collapse of democratic politics and the rise of fascism and the financial causes of that. And they want to build institutions that will prevent those kinds of financial and economic crises. And some of the critical one is the IMF, which is how do you organize a system of international currencies and manage the relative value of those currencies in a way that works better than the old system of the gold standard. But the value of currencies and the relative value of currencies was understood to be based on the trade between countries, and above all, the trade in raw materials. And so at the same time as the Bretton Woods conference, in which we're setting up one set of international institutions, there was another conference actually in Havana, Cuba. And this, of course, was Havana before the revolution. And the countries of the world, the members of the UN, gathered there to try and organize a system for the governing of world trade, and in particular, well, among other things, the pricing of commodities, particularly of raw materials, those produced in the south, but depended on by the north. It produced an agreement eventually, and the agreement never went anywhere because it was vetoed by the US Senate, and there was no agreement over the pricing of commodities and the managing of world trade until one got sort of minor forms of that, and eventually one got an American imposed system, which was the World Trade Organization, many decades later. But that collapsed, and collapsed because the US was very concerned about demands, particularly from Latin American countries, India, and other countries producing from the global south, that this would somehow hamper the power of these multinational corporations that tended to dominate trade in key raw materials. So that was part of the story. What happens is that really does leave the power in the hands of the multinational corporations, and more so than any in the multinational corporations controlling the flow of oil, because oil was by far the largest commodity in world trade. About 50% of world trade in the post-war period was the trade in oil. Those multinationals kept that power over not just the producing, but the pricing, the supply, and the pricing of oil.
And I would like also to go one step back when you mentioned how the economy was constructed as an abstract thing. And I would like to bring a quote from the book. So I would like to ask John to bring it to the front. Thanks, John. So democratic politics developed thanks to oil with a peculiar orientation towards the future. The future was a limitless horizon of growth. So in a sense, there was always a projection to the future, towards the future, as if something we have to wait, something would be better in the future without looking at the present, what's happening. And also, I remember watching one interview, one talk you gave in 2017 at Bath University, where you talk about green growth and the idea of growth, that we still have it in our minds. Should we kind of, and then we also hear things like degrowth or carbon neutral growth. Is it just always kind of a restricting notion that we always kind of talk in this growth environment? How should we understand it? How should we deal with it? Should we just dump it and look for something else, or?
Well, unfortunately, we don't get to decide to dump it, but but I think we can be more aware of how it came into being and how recent it is. As I said, before really the 1940s and 1950s, no economist talked about an object called the economy. They talked about business, they talked about trade, they talked about housing and cities and all kinds of things. But the notion that all these formed a totality that could be measured in its totality as the economy, and of course the invention of measures of that totality in the form of GDP, the gross domestic product, all that is something, it develops in the interwar period, but it sort of takes hold of the political imagination and the discipline of economics in the post-war period. So it's recent. We used to have perfectly adequate ways of thinking about collective life, and before that didn't envelop everything in an overarching concept of growth. Some things grew, some things didn't. Populations grew, but then they stopped growing and they declined. Well-being increased, but then well-being decreased. There were all kinds of ways in which you could measure the human condition, and instead we substitute this one overarching metric called growth. So that's been, of course, an object of a lot of discussion recently over this notion of green growth, and a dispute even among those who want a radical transformation away from fossil fuels, of whether that can be done under a rubric of growth. Is it still possible to have growth but make it green? Or should we actually be thinking in terms of degrowth? The trouble with the two sides of that argument is that they tend to, with some exceptions, assume we know what growth is and that we're happy with the definition of what growth is. Even as soon as categories like GDP and their measurement were first invented, everyone began to point out that how limited they are. They're limited partly because they leave things out. They leave out unpaid labor, or they leave out all kinds of measures of well-being like health or leisure time. But even the things they're meant to get right, the actual measuring of economic life, they have a very hard time doing, because these notions were invented when, in an age of industrial society where most of what was being measured was the production of physical goods. And then there were a few other things on the side that were sort of residual, and you added in, and they were called services. So things like lawyers did and teachers did, it's called services. But you were counting the increase in material goods, and then the movement of the finance of the system of monies that between those who produce and those who purchase those goods. We don't live in that world anymore. When we measure this thing called GDP, 80% plus of what we're measuring is not goods, it's not objects, it's things called services, which cannot easily be measured by a rubric of growth. So it's not that we've got to decide, do we want growth or do we want degrowth? And then, of course, that we want that growth to be green. It's how do we find a different kind of language that does not start from the measurement of growth or degrowth. So that's a whole set of questions around the invention of the economy. The economy is this thing that grows infinitely, and now today, what do we do when we realize that infinite growth is not a possibility?
So when it comes to the term of self-determination, which you also cover, how is the term self-determination used to enhance the role of the oil corporations in these petrol producing countries? So I think of inevitably Nasser comes to mind, Mossadegh and Chavez, as well as people more to the on the right as well. How is democracy as a recipe that can be implemented from whether imposed from above or from the outside or from within? How is this utilized by the oil corporations? These are two rather different questions.
Yeah, so in the book Carbon Democracy, I mostly trace this more historically to the period during and after the First World War, when the term first comes into use. It's usually associated with Woodrow Wilson and the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War. Actually, he didn't coin the term, he borrowed it from Lenin. But it was being widely used by the left in Europe, by the socialists in Britain, in Scandinavia, and elsewhere, in order to try and avoid future imperial wars by basing the post-war order on a more democratic political order. And of course, this is right after.
It's curious that you mentioned Woodrow Wilson borrowed it from Lenin, because didn't Woodrow Wilson declare a resource war on Mexico at some point?
Sure. It's not just that he borrowed it from Wilson, he changed its meaning. Sorry, from Lenin, he changed his meaning, or at least the meaning that it was beginning to have among socialist, democratic socialist parties in Europe. They were concerned about how to democratize foreign policy and avoid imperial wars. Woodrow Wilson used it to mean that we'll still have imperialism, but we'll ask those who we are establishing imperial power over how they would like to be ruled, or who they would like to have as their ruler. And the place where this really came to a head was when the League of Nations adopted this principle, and in particular people in Egypt said, fine, we will send a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. And the British said, no, you won't. This doesn't apply to you. We've already sorted out as the colonial occupier how you are ruled. And Wilson just acquiesced in that British decision, as well as many others, to interpret it in this much weaker sense. And because even as it gained momentum, it tended to be associated with the notion that countries outside the West should be governed by their own authorities, and less with a principle of a democratically based social order, so that all kinds of people could appeal to it as a principle against imperial intervention, but not necessarily as a principle that would found a democratic order at home.
I would like to continue on what we started before, how the economy as an abstract thing was constructed, but also how nature was kind of excluded from the equation. So I would like also to introduce another quote from the book. So John, if you can bring the nature quote to the front, please. So nature, Latour suggests, is a term we should abandon, for it is a way for assembling the common world without due process. The appeal to nature shortcuts political debate and contestation. Nature is understood as a realm of facts separate from values, from the messy subjective world of politics. So kind of nature just reduced to kind of numbers that should be monitored and kind of controlled and managed without with the use of experts. And then so like people just were reduced to just consumers and producers, and then they have nature that should be variables. So how did the split kind of rapid or increase this or increase the rate of climate change? Was it connected, that this split between nature as a environment that we live in and we are part of it, or is it just something more economically?
No, I mean, quoting the first part of that passage from Bruno Latour's book, The Politics of Nature. It comes partly out of what we've already been talking about in terms of the idea of the economy, the measurement of GDP, doing that in a way that excludes nature as something that has to be valued in its own right. Things are only valued in the measurement of GDP if they have some kind of market price or one can be imputed to them. And so by definition, nature as something beyond the way humans want to exploit it is not there in measuring forms of value and well-being. But I think there's a larger point that Latour is making, and that I was sort of went on to draw upon, which is the problem with environmental politics when we do think of nature as something sort of outside ourselves, that we've organized a way of life and somehow neglected or ignored nature, or not thought about the future consequences of what we do in relation to, so it sort of treats nature as this pristine thing outside ourselves rather than as something that our lives are imbricated with, involved with at every level. And it also it can be a sort of paralyzing thing because it's this huge thing out there that we somehow have to suddenly turn and relate to, rather than a way of thinking about our collective world made up of many things besides GDP and besides even just others at the level of human politics, but made up. It's a complex world made up of many kinds of agents and actors, some human, but some taking other forms as well. And it's an attempt to sort of enrich our notion of nature in those kinds of ways, but also to understand why they became so narrow, because it wasn't that we didn't in the past have richer senses of our involvement with the other forces that make up the collective world.
I would like to delve in also an interesting section that you talk about the connection between, well, in the present, the US dollar, but before it was also the British currency and the oil and also arms industries. So this kind of the power triangle. But you also mentioned that the power comes from the weakness of oil companies to maintain the rents that they were gaining. So is this triangle still strong or prominent at this moment, or is it because that became or financialization of the economy became more prominent, the role of, or the connection between oil and the US dollar is still strong?
It's still strong, and obviously it's a big story with a long history. Over the course of the 20th century, this dependence on oil was produced. It was engineered, and as oil became this thing that we felt we couldn't live without, countries everywhere had to purchase it. They didn't purchase it on the market because before the late 1970s, there was no such thing as an oil market. Everything was handled within the circuits of these multinational, vertically integrated corporations that produced the oil, shipped the oil, and then sold the oil through their own networks of gas, petrol stations, and dealers. So there wasn't an oil market, but there was an oil price, and that had to be paid. Because it was the largest commodity in world trade, this became a central part not just of commodity trade, but of finance as well. And that meant, first of all, that every country had to find, in mostly dollars. There was some oil that the British still controlled that was priced in pounds, but most and eventually all oil came to be priced in dollars. And the US worked very hard to prevent non-dollar oil becoming available, for example, to stop the USSR from exporting oil that might not be priced in dollars or that might upset this pricing system. But something more begins to happen, and really quite a significant shift, particularly beginning in the late 60s and then after the quadrupling of oil prices in the so-called oil crisis of 73, 74, which is that the price of oil, as I say, goes up, and the profits to be made by oil companies, and now also from that period on, the oil producing countries, are absolutely enormous on an unprecedented kind of scale. Now, what you can do with that is you can also then build a whole financial industry on it, because knowing that these oil revenues are going to start to flow both into the oil companies, but after the mid-70s into the treasuries of Middle East and other oil-producing countries, you can start to extend finance to those countries and start making money in another way by lending money against the future oil revenues. And you're going to get a vast explosion of mostly American, but also European banks offering credit against those future oil revenues. The trouble is, you can offer them all the credit because you want to earn all the interest and fees of recouping those loans over time. But what on earth are they going to buy? They've got generally small populations. They've got even when they've got larger populations like Iran, they're extraordinarily unequal. So most people are living relatively poor lives. So there's rich who want to import some Mercedes and luxury goods and so on, but you can't loan them money on the kind of scale that would create the kind of credit that banks now want to live off, thanks to the oil industry. So you have to think of something else they might need, and the solution is simple. They need arms. And they need arms on a vast scale. So whereas before the transfer of arms to the third world was a sort of aspect of economic aid where you threw in a few weapons as well, or you went and fought a war and you spent all the money on arms yourself, now all of a sudden these governments, these oil-producing governments, are going to be encouraged to buy weapons on this extraordinary scale. Both to benefit the weapons manufacturers, of course, who will make their profits, but even more so to benefit the banks, because the weapons won't be paid for by and large in current oil revenues. They'll be paid for in future oil revenues. And so you create this vast credit system, a vast financialized world out of the sale of arms. So that then takes off from the late 60s even, but is extensively in the 70s, the sale of arms to Iran, to Saudi Arabia, to other countries of the Gulf, on this flow of future oil revenues.
This is all very interesting. I remember hearing about the first petrodollar crisis in Venezuela, before which Venezuelan elites were buying nearly anything, including many vacations to Aruba. But but more relevant to the question of arms, or well, the Kyoto protocols, as well as other climate agreements, let all signing countries, let all signatories exempt their military industries. The US Army today remains perhaps the foremost consumer of jet fuel worldwide, with all its military bases. Now, the first article I ever wrote for this particular movement, which is today interviewing you, DiEMtv, was titled "The Green New Deal Needs an Anti-War Message," because looking at the Green New Deal, we saw that it lacked a message about military industries. Why do the environmental institutions and fashionable new movements lack an anti-war rhetoric? Why don't they? Can you tell us about this? Like, why do you believe such foundations don't draw a connection between military industries and oil?
It's difficult to find a single reason. I think partly because it varies from country to country. In the US, for example, where there's historically always been powerful anti-war movements, but obviously not in the mainstream and never even powerful enough to prevent the 2003 Iraq War or the long continuing endless series of wars since then, Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Yemen, and so on. It's not helped by the fact that militarism, of course, is said to create jobs and to benefit local economies, and the way US politics is organized, those kinds of arguments can be made for these ever increasing levels of military spending. And I think, mostly when one's talking about, the scale of the military use and the military exemption you talk about for the burning of fossil fuels, I'm fairly certain what the US does exceeds every other country in the world put together. Certainly most other large military spenders, whether in terms of expenditure or use of fossil fuels. So one's really talking about the failure of US politics, and that reflects, of course, the extreme limits on sort of democratic politics within the US, the overrepresentation of conservative forces in the very structure of the political system and the way the media is controlled and so on. But you're right, it doesn't receive the kind of attention it might.
So your work has explored the links between the emergence of mass democracy, coal, and how the shift from one form of fossil fuel to a very different liquid form of fossil fuel completely ended up renegotiating international political rights and the system of democracy. Now, many of the progressive movements are talking about the Green New Deal, and even a significant part of the corporate world is talking about ecological matters. There was a recent controversy and accusations that Elon Musk was, for example, very interested in the lithium deposits in Bolivia. And there's also a lot of conversation, of course, about what will the future be of solar power and other renewable energy forms. Now, with all this euphoria and all this positive thinking about renewable energy, I wonder, what is the danger? What will go missing in all of that? And I wonder if your work is also issuing a warning to us that maybe these new forms of alternative energy or safer energy, and certainly those who are seen as the luminaries behind this progress, like Elon Musk and so on, are these people planning perhaps to segue, to exclude the democratic potential to structure this in a way that evades further, just as petroleum was in some ways quite harmful to mass democracy, and the jump from coal to petroleum. Will the jump from petroleum to solar and lithium and cold fusion or whatever, will that jump allow more or much less democratization? And what are the dangers or the potentials?
Well, it's more a question of potentials than being able to say it'll happen one way or the other. And part of the purpose of the book Carbon Democracy, and particularly in its concluding chapter and the postscript that I added for the paperback, is not to predict what's going to happen, but to try and provide a way of thinking about what's at stake and what kinds of ways of thinking are going to shape the outcome of that question about whether the switch to renewables will be a democratizing experience or not. I mean, the first thing one can say is that it's going to be a little harder to, potentially a little harder to develop the kinds of monopolistic control of renewables that was possible with oil through much of the 20th century. But that doesn't mean automatically, because things are less monopolistic, they're more democratic. I mean, prior to the rise of fossil fuels, the source of energy was very highly distributed. People got their energy from woodlands and from fields and from animals, and they were very widely distributed, but that didn't make life particularly democratic. And it was indeed precisely the concentration of forces around coal that created that point of vulnerability for those in control, that their source of wealth could be threatened with interruption. And so I think it's more important to think about points of vulnerability, points of possible sabotage, than, oh, once everything's distributed and shared, by definition, it'll be more democratic. That said, there are very different ways of organizing the production of renewable energy. They can be done, it's not so much a question of scale, though that's part of it. Obviously, things happen on utility scale and things happen at very local scales. And the local scale stuff is perhaps more open to local control, whereas the utility scale production of wind power or solar power is more susceptible to control and to monopolization by large corporate forces. But it's saying, what is the political form that is appropriate to the production of energy? And it's interesting to think about the difference between, say, the history of coal and then oil and the history of electricity production, because after initially beginning using private firms, a lot of the production of electricity actually happened through the creation of publicly owned utilities. The whole movement of municipalization, as it was called, in the last part of the 19th century and through the 20th century, organized the production and the supply of electricity as a public right, as a public service. And that principle could as easily be the principle under which renewable energy is produced as the one of private corporate ownership. That's a political decision. That's not one directly built into the nature of the energy. People will say, well, you know, the scale of investment we need for the transition to renewable energy is so vast, we have no choice but to turn to the private sector, private capital. There is actually no logic to that argument. Renewable energy pays for itself. It pays for itself by being able to fund it through making available the future revenues. because over the 20, 40, 50-year life of any large renewable energy installation, people will pay, and they'll pay normal rates to that. And you can set up a credit system that those future payments pay the installation cost, which is a fraction of what the future income will be. There's no reason that has to be in private hands, or if you want to use that organization, fund it, use the capital raising privately. It doesn't mean the ownership has to be in private hands. So, at each of these points, the funding, the building, the network that distributes it, you can make a decision about questions of public versus private ownership, and questions of who will benefit from the return on the capital invested. Because the thing about the Green New Deal, about any Green New Deal, is not the amount of capital needed up front. It's the extraordinary income that's going to flow from that in the future. Is that going to be private income, or is that going to be income that in some sense is collectively owned after paying off the, as I say, relatively minimal costs in the long run of installing the equipment?
I have, maybe we need to wrap up, but I have just the last question, which kind of builds on on our whole discussion. So when we talk about climate change and then to move to renewables, and if I also take the point about inequality, that is also a driver of the speed of climate change, that inequality by itself, and also the wars that being kind of endless wars. So if we take an example as Iraq, that recently they had to submit to get a loan from the IMF for $6 billion because they were not able to kind of keep running. So a country that has a big amount of oil revenues, but then kind of asked to move to renewables, sorry, $6 billion, and then they have to from external investments that they have to move to renewables, but these renewables are produced from private countries from outside, so the country is kept like in debt. So how does, well, do you think that we should kind of move completely to renewables, or we should like have a mix and try to mitigate how as you mentioned, the collective has to come together to define what is the energy needed to continue building it to the future?
Well, I think we know that if the world doesn't become carbon neutral by 2050, we don't stand much chance of keeping the Earth habitable for the majority of its population. So I don't think there's any doubt about the need to eliminate the use of fuels that contribute to the accumulation of carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere. Of course, some of the big oil companies are hoping that it will be possible to keep fossil fuels alive through investing in forms of carbon capture and storage. I think Shell is particularly taking that line, among others. It seems much simpler, given the fact that nobody has found a cost-effective way to carry out carbon capture and storage, to push ahead with renewables that are not only cost-effective, but they're becoming cheaper all the time. So yes, the answer seems to the first part of your question is that there is this transition to renewables happening, and I think it's accelerating much faster than people even 4 or 5 years ago expected. I mean, Shell just announced a week or so ago that 2019 was its own corporate year of peak oil production. It is never going to produce as much oil as it produced in 2019. People knew that peak oil was coming for each of these giant companies, but they thought it was coming in another decade or the mid-20s, and it's already passed. So that's happening. There was another part to your question. I'm not sure
yeah, sure, I can gladly repeat. So for example, if I take Iraq as an example, has a big oil reserves, and then it's asked to move to renewables, that they have to get loans because they are kind of almost bankrupt. So they have to get loans in order to buy these renewable energy sources, renewable energy devices. But then these are also owned by private companies, so they are kind of kept in shackles in the debt. So they are not able to kind of decide by themselves, but they have to also get loose of their own resources. So how this dilemma would work?
Yeah, I mean, the advantage that Iraq and the other Gulf countries have in relation to other fossil fuel producing regions is that ultimately they can still produce oil at a much, much cheaper rate than it can be produced in North America or other major oil producing. So you know, if the price were to collapse back down again, it would be probably just a few countries of the Middle East that were able to continue supplying for the 20 or 30 years that's still going to be oil in use, and it would be the US oil industry that went bankrupt, which it's barely managing to avoid at the moment, particularly with the shale industry part of it, the tight oil part of it. But yes, it's unfortunate for those countries that will still sit on large reserves of oil after the end of production. I'm not sure how large those remaining reserves will be, because these countries have been producing oil already for 70, 80, 100 years, and they're finding it, even though they produce it more cheaply, they're finding it harder and harder to produce that oil. Nevertheless, this transition is happening. They do have the advantage that, you know, they, in the long run, of course, that they can benefit from production at least of solar energy in a way that colder parts of the world cannot. But they also, I mean, the real problem Iraq and the Gulf faces is that the impacts of climate change there are going to be potentially so much worse than in many other parts of the world. It's not just that, like other places, it's going to get hotter, but there's a particular interaction between the waters of the Gulf, the South Asian monsoon, and global warming that is potentially going to make the Gulf, the cities of the Gulf, uninhabitable, certainly under current scenarios. That simply means that the air temperature is such that the body can no longer physically cool itself by sweating, because it's surpassed a temperature which human sweat regulates body temperature, and therefore if you go outside, you die. So there are costs to be paid in the transition away from fossil fuels, and there are very unfavorable terms that the IMF imposes in making loans for some of that. But on the other side, the consequences for that particular region with unchecked or not sufficiently checked global warming are pretty serious. You know, I think introducing the IMF comes back to the same question I just made about alternative views. There are different ways to create credit and for people to benefit from the creation of credit. You know, credit is money borrowed from the future. The question is, are you borrowing that money from the future in a way that will benefit a society and benefit the society in an egalitarian way and in a way that enhances people's modes of living, and on terms that are reasonable for paying back? Or are you doing it in such a way that you are just continuing to enhance the both the profits of the Wall Street banks that will help fund IMF loans, and the local elites who will also profit from their place in the circuit of some of those funds? So it's not borrowing per se that's the problem. It's the political terms under which that is organized.
So, Dr. Mitchell, we find this very fascinating, and we are reaching the end of the program. I would like to ask a very open question that allows you to perhaps reach for perhaps what the core is of your overall thesis in carbon democracy. Like, perhaps, do you take the work of the historian back to a more materialist analysis, for example, during this time when people are far less materialist and more perhaps identity oriented? Is that part of your project? That's perhaps a side question, of course, not the core of it. Or is what you just said about credit for the future, would this be, or a warning to make sure to take advantage of the democratic potential in the energy systems?
Thanks. That's a big question in a way, but I hope that sort of reading the book gives you a sense of the kind of ways that I've tried to answer that question. The book is very concerned with the material, with coal mines and pipelines and oil and how it flows, and workers, and tries to move the study of the question of democracy, of democratic futures, of climate change, move it along at that kind of level of material and technical arrangements, and to understand democratic politics as not just a set of sort of good and liberal ideas in people's heads, but an apparatus that is built out of the points and the moments where people in their working lives, in their social lives, get points of leverage that allow them not to speak, because that's not always the problem, but to be listened to be heard, to be answered. So yes, it's more material, but it's material in a very specific kind of way. And one of the ways that's specific is that when it turns to questions of money, credit, finance, financialization, it is not turning away from the material, because those, as I try to show through the history of the oil industry, and we've just talked about with the future of renewable fuels, credit and finance is built out of material arrangements, out of particular apparatuses that give some people control over future revenue and not others, share that future. I mean, that's what finance and credit is. It's a particular set of claims on the future that have to be repaid. And that's a material question. It's not taking us off into some other realm of finance that is somehow is separate from the way material life is lived.
That's just an amazing finish for our interesting interview. So I would like to thank you, Professor Mitchell, for joining us and giving quite extensive overview of the book. So
thank you, Mohammad. Thank you, Arturo. It was great to have the chance to talk.
Great. Thank you.